Hello there. Today I will be summarizing and explaining the history and impact of the United States v. Lopez Supreme Court case of 1995. Prior to the Supreme Court case, Congress passed the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990, which made it a federal offense for, quote, any individual knowingly to possess a firearm at a place that the individual knows or has reasonable cause to believe is a school zone, end quote. In violation of this act, Alfonso Lopez Jr., a high school senior at the time, knowingly possessed a concealed handgun as well as the bullets for said handgun at his San Antonio high school. As a result, he was convicted in a federal district court. The case concerning this issue was first sent to the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, where the court decided that the law was beyond Congress's power under the Commerce Clause, which is where Congress deemed its own jurisdiction for passing the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990, since they believed it interfered with interstate commerce. Due to this decision, the government appealed to the Supreme Court, which argued the case on November 7, 1994, and decided on the case on April 25, 1995. The Supreme Court that dealt with the United States v. Lopez case was the Rehnquist Court of 1994 to 2005, which was composed of Supreme Court Chief Justice William Rehnquist and Associate Judges Sandra Day O'Connor, John Paul Stevens, Antonin Scalia, Anthony Kennedy, David Souter, Clarence Thomas, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Stephen Breyer. Within the court, the judges were split between a conservative ideology, which comprised of William Rehnquist, Sandra Day O'Connor, John Paul Stevens, Antonin Scalia, Anthony Kennedy, David Souter, and Clarence Thomas, and a liberal ideology, which included Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer. The Supreme Court case decision ended with a 5-4 vote in which the court determined that Congress had exceeded its constitutional authority under the Commerce Clause. With this decision, the court also ruled that the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990 was unconstitutional because, quote, the possession of a gun in a local school zone is not an economic activity that might, through repetition elsewhere, have substantial effect on interstate commerce, end quote. The law was determined to be a criminal statute that had nothing to do with commerce or any sort of economic activity. The Supreme Court justices that aligned with this majority opinion consisted of Rehnquist, O'Connor, Scalia, Kennedy, and Thomas. As a result, Alfonso Lopez Jr.'s conviction was overturned. The court decision overall for this case was very tight, with there being no stark divide between the amount of votes on either side of the case. The minority opinion of the court, led by Justice Breyer, argued in favor of Congress's commerce power, stating that the buying and selling of guns and associated illicit activities affect interstate commerce, and with this, Congress may regulate under the Commerce Clause. They followed this opinion with the belief that gun violence in schools leads to both more dangerous and less commercially healthy neighborhoods and less economically productive kids. The Supreme Court justices that aligned with this minority opinion consisted of Stevens, Souter, Ginsburg, and Breyer. However, in response to this, the majority opinion, led by Chief Justice Rehnquist, argued that regulating guns in local schools does not come close enough in relation to Congress's Commerce Clause power in order to regard the act as constitutional. The Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990 contains no provisions stating that the unlawful possession must be related to interstate commerce. Also in the court case, Congress provided no hard evidence showing the relation between gun violence in schools and interstate commerce. Congress only provided theories which provided weak links between the two. Thus, the majority opinion of the court concluded that Congress had overstepped its powers by taking over the state's typical role in handling state crimes. Since 1937 up until United States v. Lopez, the Supreme Court had always upheld and expanded Congress's powers under the Commerce Clause. Before the New Deal, the Supreme Court interpreted the Commerce Clause literally and narrowly, ruling in United States v. E.C. Knight of 1895 and Shetcher Poultry v. United States of 1935, for example, that the Commerce Clause only permits federal regulation of the buying, selling, and transportation of goods between states, not over the manufacture of goods within states. even if that manufacturer was closely related to the interstate commerce. Yet, beginning in the 1930s, the Supreme Court changed its course, ruling that federal laws regulating the local production of goods substantially affected interstate commerce and was constitutional. With the decision of United States v. Lopez, this practice was greatly changed, limiting Congress's growing commerce power. Following United States v. Lopez, the Supreme Court cases of United States v. Morrison of 1999 and Solid Waste Agency of Northern Cook County v. United States Army Corps of Engineers of 2001 both landed case decisions which resulted in limiting Congress's power under the Commerce Clause and other enumerated powers respectively. Overall, United States v. Lopez has been considered a landmark Supreme Court case because, for the first time in 50 years, the decision made by the court limited Congress's commerce power, which only seemed to grow prior to United States v. Lopez. This decision marked a turning point in the Supreme Court, postulating just how far they were willing to grant Congress constitutionality under the Commerce Clause. The case itself established a new idea that Congress's commerce power is not infinitely growing and that the court will no longer constantly work to help expand the commerce powers of Congress. Following the United States v. Lopez decision, Congress revised the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990, with the necessary interstate commerce hook utilized in other federal gun laws. This revised version of the law is in effect today, and no overturned convictions have occurred under this revised law since the Lopez decision.